Hi there, welcome to the Over the Moon tutorial. This online pattern is designed to create a chic and versatile piece that can be worn as a stylish jacket or an oversized blouse. With a relaxed boxy fit, extended armholes, and large statement pockets with oversized flaps, it offers both functionality and structure. The pockets are fully lined, adding a clean finish and extra durability. The easy silhouette ensures comfort while the oversized pockets add a bold, practical detail. This pattern involves basic sewing techniques with some attention to detail, making it perfect for those ready to challenge themselves with a few new skills while still being accessible to sewists with some experience. The pattern is drafted in intermediate size and leans toward a cropped length, so it's important to check the finished garment measurements before cutting in case you like to adjust the length. All of this information, including the size chart, fabric suggestions, fabric requirements based on fabric width, and the step-by-step written instructions with diagrams, is included in the handbook. And with this being said, it's time to bring this pattern to life. First, let's go over all the materials. You will need your main fabric. This pattern is designed with versatility in mind, allowing you to create either a statement button-down oversized blouse or a jacket style by choosing the right fabric. For a blouse, opt for lightweight to medium weight fabrics with a soft drape for a fluid and comfortable fit. But for jackets, choose medium to heavyweight fabrics with more structure and stability to achieve the look of a light jacket. Select an interfacing that complements your fabric. Lighter for delicate fabrics and heavier for structured materials. For this pattern, I will be using iron-on fusible interfacing for ease of application and added stability. For the buttons, we will be using two different sizes to enhance the design details. One each buttons for the pockets to create a statement look, and half to 5/8 of an inch buttons to the cuff and buttoning placket for a balanced and functional finish. For the sewing thread, you can choose between a matching color for a seamless look or a contrasting color to highlight the stitching details. For my version, I'm using a lighter green thread to create subtle contrast against the fabric. And finally, the pattern. It comes in sizes extra small to double extra large, and you will find it linked below in the description box. Before cutting, we're gonna prep our fabric by ironing with enough steam to pre-shrink it. Then set the patterns on the wrong side of the fabric, placing the grain line parallel to the selvage of the fabric. Make sure the distance between the grain line and the edges of the fabric is the same at the top and bottom of the arrow. This allows setting the pattern straight. Use pins or weight to secure the pattern and avoid movement. And since the pattern has the seam allowance included, just cut the pieces following the outer edge of the paper. Don't forget to transfer marks points and notches to the fabric. Some pieces are recommended to be cut from interfacing as well to add stability and structure, especially in areas like the bottom placket, cuffs, and pocket flaps. Be sure to check the pattern instructions for specific pieces that require interfacing based on your fabric choice. On the edges of the fabric, mark and cut several strips measuring 1 to maximum 1¼ inches wide, depending on your desired strap thickness. These strips will be joined later to create a continuous bias tape, which should measure at least 40 inches in length. This will be used to clean finish areas like the neckline and the sleeve slit. On the front pattern, you will find drill holes marking the placement for the flap and the pocket. You could transfer them using a awl and punching them directly into the fabric. However, I recommend transferring them with thread instead. To do so, thread a hand sewing needle using a contrasting thread color so it's easy to see, and leave long thread tails for flexibility. Starting from the top layer of the fabric, push the needle through at the drill hole location, going from top to bottom, and leave long threads on both sides. Carefully remove the pattern without disturbing the threads. Then tie small knots at both ends of the thread to secure the marks. Open the two front fabric pieces and cut the threads in the middle to create independent threads marking for each layer. Finally, tie knots at the remaining ends of the threads to keep the marking secure. This method prevents marking permanent holes in the fabric, giving you the flexibility to adjust the pocket position after fitting. With the help of your iron, add fusible interfacing to the flap, cuff, and placket areas for added structure. For my jacket, I also decided to add fusible interfacing to the pockets for extra structure, but feel free to skip this step if you prefer a softer look for the pockets. Following the notches, fold quarter of an inch on the outer edge of the placket towards the wrong side of the fabric. Then fold again until you reach the notch, enclosing the raw edges. Then press the folds to keep them in place and edge stitch along the outer folded edge to secure the placket neatly. Next, with right side facing, sew the patch pocket self to the lining pocket at the top edge. Leave an opening in between this stitch to flip the pocket later on. Once sewn, pull the lining pocket down towards the bottom and press at the top. Then sew the sides and bottom edges for a clean finish using quarter of an inch of seam allowance. Trim the corners to reduce bulk and from the escape hole or the opening that we left before, turn the pocket right side out. With the help of a chopstick or knitting needle, gently push out the corners and edges of the pockets to shape them neatly. Press the pocket flap and run a top stitch along the top edge of the pocket to close the escape hole and secure the area. Place the flap pieces right sides together, aligning the edges, and pin or clip to secure it. Sew along the sides and bottom edge using quarter of an inch of seam allowance, leaving the top edge open. Then trim the corners to reduce bulk and turn the flap right side out, pushing out the corners gently with a chopstick or knitting needle. Next, press the flap flat, ensuring a crisp finish. Then top stitch around the sides and bottom edge with either a single stitch for a clean look or a double stitch for a more structured utility style finish. Repeat the same procedure for both pockets. Following the pocket placements suggested on the pattern, place the pocket on the right side of the front piece, ensuring it is aligned correctly. Pin or clip the pocket in place, and then edge stitch around the entire pocket to secure it firmly to the front piece. At the end of the seam, follow a triangle shape like this to reinforce the top part of the pocket for added durability. Following the flap placement marking on the pattern, align the raw edge of the flap with the designated placement line on the garment, ensuring the flap is positioned correctly. Pin or clip it in place, then stitch along the raw edge using quarter of an inch of seam allowance. If needed, trim any excess fabric to reduce bulk. Next, fold the flap downwards to the pocket opening and press it flat. Finally, secure the flap in place by top stitching along the previous sewn edge, using 3/8 to maximum half an inch of seam allowance, ensuring a clean and professional finish. Reinforce the stress points of the pocket flap with bar tacks, which are short and then zigzag stitch. To do so, set your machine to a narrow zigzag with a very short stitch length, and then sew back and forth a few times over the same spot. With right sides together, align the front and back pieces at the shoulder and side seams. Pin or clip them in place and then sew using half an inch of seam allowance. Now is the perfect moment to try it on and check for any necessary adjustments. Look for things like fit around the bust, waist, shoulders, neckline, how the fabric drapes, and whether any tweaks are needed before moving forward. Since this pattern has a completely oversized fit, this is the right opportunity to adjust the width at the side and shoulders. If you prefer less relaxed silhouette, simply take in the seams as needed before finalizing them. Keep in mind that some changes can also affect the sleeves. Once you're happy with the fit, search side and shoulder seams close and press them towards the back. For added durability and a refined look, you can also top stitch along the shoulder and side seams. While this is primarily a design detail, it's especially useful for heavier fabrics if making the jacket version. If top stitching so close to the seam line, either as a single row for a clean finish or a double row for a more structured workwear inspired look. Join the strips together by placing them right sides facing at a 45-degree angle. Then stitch diagonally from corner to connect them. You will notice some fabric extending beyond the edges. This extra bit accounts for the seam allowance and will be trimmed off after sewing. Press the seams open and trim fabric excess. Then with wrong sides facing, fold and press the bias tape in half. Keep in mind that the final continuous bias strip should measure at least 40 inches in length. This method allows you to create bias tape efficiently, minimizing fabric waste while ensuring flexibility and durability. Next, trim one end of the bias tape and fold the end in half with right side facing. Sew along the edge using 1/4 inch of seam allowance. Trim the seam by 1/8 of an inch, then flip right side out and press for a cleaner finish. With the right side of the blouse facing up, align the raw edge of the bias tape with the raw edge of the neckline, ensuring that the clean finished edge of the bias tape is aligned with the edge of the front placket. Sew around the neckline using 1/4 inch of seam allowance, carefully following the curve. Stop a couple of inches before reaching the other side of the placket to clean finish the bias tape edge in the same way as before. Make sure to place the bias tape on top of the neckline, leaving extra length to account for the seam allowance, and align it all the way to the end. This allows you to accurately measure how much tape you will need before trimming. Fold it in half with right sides facing, sew the edges with 1/4 inch of seam allowance, trim fabric excess, and fold it right side out. Flip it back and press for a neat finish. Once the edge is clean finished, complete the stitching by attaching the remaining bias tape to the neckline. Understitch along the bias tape seam, stitching close to the tape to help it roll to the inside and prevent it from flipping to the front. Then carefully fold the bias tape all the way to the wrong side of the fabric, ensuring it's hidden and aligned neatly. And finally, edge stitch close to the folded edge of the bias tape to secure it in place. Press the neckline for a crisp and cleaner finish. Mark and cut the slit opening at the back of the sleeves as indicated on the pattern. Then add the bias tape to the wrong side of the fabric, aligning the raw edges of the tape with the raw edge of the slit. To avoid puckering while sewing, open the slit cuff as you attach the bias tape, keeping it flat and stable. Continue sewing the bias tape along the slit until you reach the other side. Then fold the bias tape all the way to the right side of the sleeve, covering the raw edge of the slit. You can press it to make the process easier and to ensure a smooth finish. Then edge stitch along the folded edge of the bias tape. With right sides facing, neatly overlap the slit edges, making sure they align properly. I recommend pressing the area beforehand to help the fabric lie flat. Then top stitch diagonally across the upper corner of the bias strip to secure the slit opening. Press to smooth the area and then on the overlapping part of the sleeve, fold the bias strip inwards. It means towards the wrong side of the fabric and press it to keep it in place. Position it on top of the other side of the bias tape or on top of the underlap area of the sleeve to mimic how it will look when closed. You can secure it with a pin to hold everything in position until you install the cuff. Note that a small pleat forming at the upper end of the slit is completely normal and helps the fabric lay smoothly. Close the pleat on the sleeve by aligning the notches and following the direction indicated on the pattern. Set in place temporarily or run a basting stitch to secure it before attaching the cuff. Then, with right size facing, close the sleeve and stitch it at the underseam using half an inch of seam allowance. Keep in mind that in oversized garments, the armhole is typically larger and positioned lower with the shoulder seam extending beyond the natural shoulder. Because of this relaxed structure, the sleeve cap doesn't require the usual ease you will see in fitted blouses or tailored jackets. The sleeve is drafted with little cap height, allowing it to fit into the armhole with minimal shaping. However, when working, if you find that the cap area stretched a little bit and now it feels a little bit larger than the armhole, you can run a basting stitch along the cap edge and gently ease it in. With right size facing, insert the sleeve into the armhole, aligning the side seam, under seam, and notches. Once the sleeve is properly positioned, sew it using half an inch of seam allowance. At this stage, I recommend you to try the garment on to check the fit, especially regarding to the length of the sleeve, and make any necessary adjustments. After confirming the fit, search the seams to clean finish the raw edges and press the seam allowance towards the body. Finally, top stitch around the armhole to secure the seam in place and add a professional finish. The cuff can be clean finished in one step or in two separate steps, which I recommend for a better finish, especially when working with thicker fabrics. That is the method I will be demonstrating here. On the internal cuff piece, the one that doesn't have the fuse, mark and fold the top edge quarter of an inch towards the wrong side of the fabric and press it to keep it in place. Then place the cuff pieces right side together and sew along the bottom edge using quarter of an inch of seam allowance. Understitch the seam allowance to the internal cuff piece, then press the seam to create a crisp edge. Press the bottom seam up to enclose the raw edges. On one of the sides, you will find the button extension. To clean that area, we are going to need to unfold the folded top of the internal cuff to stitch towards the notch. While on the opposite side of the button extension, the folded edge will remain folded in place as you sew the side seams. And with right size facing, sew the side edge of the cuff using quarter of an inch of seam allowance to enclose the raw edges. Then clip at the notch and trim the corners. You can also trim a little bit the seam allowance to reduce the bulk, especially when working with bulky fabrics. Something that I like to do is to run a second stitch just on the cuff corners to get sharper, more defined corners that hold their shape without any accidents. This extra stitch helps maintain the crispness of the cuff and prevents the corners from getting rounded or distorted. Next, flip the cuff right side out, gently pulling the corners out to create sharp edges. You can do this with your hands or getting a little bit of help from a chopstick or a knitting needle. And press it neatly for a cleaner finish. After that, top stitch around the cuff. This is something that you can do at this stage or after attaching the cuff to the sleeve. Now we're going to attach the cuff to the sleeve. Make sure to position the cuff extension or the button extension on the underlap area of the sleeves as indicated in the pattern. And with right size facing, add the external part of the cuff to the bottom of the sleeve, aligning the raw edges. Remember to keep the bias tape on the overlap part of the sleeve folded while adding the cuff. Sew the pieces together using quarter of an inch of seam allowance. Once completed, place the seam allowance towards the inside of the cuff, ensuring a smooth finish. Use the previous stitch line as a guide to place the internal cuff just slightly over it, ensuring you catch all the layers when sewing. This overlap should be minimal, just enough to secure the layers, without adding bulk when stitching on the ditch. Secure the area with pins or run a basting stitch. Finally, with the right side of the cuff facing you, stitching the ditch along the cuff seam to secure the internal cuff layer in place, keeping the stitches nearly invisible from the outside. The next step will be cleaning the hem. To do a double turn hem, start by folding the hem line up by half an inch and press it to hold the fold in place. Then fold it up once more by another half an inch, encasing the raw edges inside. Press again to keep the fold neat and even, and then stitch along the inner folded edge to secure the hem in place. To continue, add the buttonholes following the placement marks on the pattern, using your sewing machine's buttonhole function. You'll need to add buttonholes to the front placket, cuffs, and pocket flaps. As a general guide, buttonholes should measure about 1/8 of an inch longer than the size of the button. Most sewing machines create buttonholes automatically based on the button size you insert, but it's always a good idea to do a test run on a fabric scrap first because the buttonhole shouldn't be too tight or too loose. Make sure the buttons slide through smoothly without resistance or excess gap. When sewing for women, buttonholes are traditionally placed on the right side of the garment when wearing. So, as you face the garment, they should be on the left side. Mark each placement carefully and ensure all buttonholes are evenly spaced and aligned for a clean and professional look. Now open the buttonholes carefully. I like to place a pin at each end of the buttonhole to stop the seam ripper from cutting too far and accidentally slicing through the stitching. Then, using a seam ripper and a small pair of clippers, gently open the buttonholes. Once they are open, position the placket over the opposite side, the one where the buttons will go, and mark the button placements through the buttonholes to ensure everything is aligned and even. Follow the same procedure for the remaining buttonholes. The final touch will be to sew the buttons in place. I'm using buttons with a built-in shank, so the process of attaching them is slightly different from the flat buttons. If you are using buttons without a shank, don't worry, I'll be linking a video tutorial here that shows you exactly how to sew those as well. I start by double threading my needle and waxing the thread to prevent it from tangling. I anchor the thread to the fabric with a few small stitches to keep it secure. Then I position the button and stitch through the shank several times, pulling the thread snug each time to ensure the button is firmly attached. I also loop the thread around a few times to make it more secure. And to finish, I just tie a knot on the underside, hide the threads inside the fabric, and then trim any excess. I will continue this process for each button until all of them are securely attached. To finish, give your garment a final press and that's it. Here is the result. I hope you enjoy following along as much as I love creating this with you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I would love to hear from you. Thank you for being part of this creative journey. I will see you in the next one. Have a happy sewing. Bye.